Hello, everyone. My name is Eric. I'm a limited licensed master social worker and psychotherapist. I've been working with children, youth, and adults for 10 years. On this episode of So, You Want to Learn Psychology? We're going to be taking a look at one of my favorite Jungian analysts and what might be one of her most popular works. Marie-Louise Von Franz was one of the last true students of Jung. She had her own chapter in his final book, Man and His Symbols, and she went on to write her own books, many on different topics including alchemical symbolism, psychotherapy, and even physics, which seems like quite a departure from the realm of psychology, but in actuality it fits quite nicely. The book we're going to be looking at today is none of those, but it might be one of her most famous works, The Feminine in Fairy Tales. Along with Dr. Karen Horney, Von Franz is probably my favorite female psychologist and author. The distinction is made here between male and female not to imply that her work is good for a female psychologist, but because ultimately, men and women are fundamentally and archetypally different, and so even our psychologies are different, albeit with many similarities. Her contributions to feminine psychology are immense and inarguable. The Feminine in Fairy Tales is a great place to begin in order to understand the archetypal differences between men and women, because it doesn't just begin and end in biology. This book begins and ends in the stories and myths that pervade every culture about the divine feminine in both her positive and negative aspects. She relates to our culture's myths and legends, to psychological development of feminine psychology, and even with all the differences between men and women, the overall psychological goal stays the same. Individuation, or the goal of achieving psychological wholeness, is that archetypal goal that makes our differences more or less solutions to the problem of being too one-sided. We all intuitively recognize that men and women are different, and different qualities are given their respective adjectives, masculine and feminine, but these distinctions are less important than the overall goal, which is to reach a balance between the two. We all know people who are too feminine and people who are too masculine, although we may not exactly describe them as such. Toxic masculinity in our culture is very easily identifiable, but we haven't quite made the leap to point out toxic femininity in our culture despite it absolutely being there. In fact, I think of a recent Netflix documentary I watched about a mother who bullied her high school-aged daughter into breaking up with her boyfriend to the point that her mother even told her that she should take her own life. Then, somehow, she got her daughter to forgive her, and they are now incredibly and pathologically close. If that isn't toxic femininity, I don't know what is. Either way, the point of the book, and the point of this video, isn't to concretize the differences between men and women. It's about the feminine aspects of psychology that are represented in our world's cultures, myths, and legends, and how we can identify the influence of the feminine, or lack thereof, in psychotherapy with our patients. With that being said, let's begin. If you ask, what are you as an individual? Most people point to their bodies. But put the question to yourself. What is individual about my ego? The fact that I have an ego is not individual. It is the most common and most normal complex among human beings. Both men and women start from a relatively equal starting point in their developmental psychology. The ego is not unique to men or women, and not at all unique amongst any certain group of people in the world. Every human being goes through the process of ego development, even to the point where, in accordance with different cultural belief systems, ego preservation, ego strengthening, and even ego death become goals for certain individuals. In this case, we're interested in how ego development affects personal psychology, from healthy functioning to neurosis and psychosis. Von Franz writes, neurosis in early youth shows as an ego consciousness backwards in its development. If one looks at the unconscious processes in children, one will see that there are at play impulses, dreams, and fantasies that tend to bring forth the ego maturity that the child should have. So we could say that it is the unconscious which wants the improvements in the ego. The infantile ego does not want it. It is the impulse from the unconscious that causes the neurotic disturbance in its attempts to get the child to a higher level of consciousness, to build up a stronger ego complex. most human difficulties, including neurotic and psychotic dissociation, are linked with an ego that is not functioning in accordance with the total disposition of the psyche. There is a kind of disharmony between it and the makeup of the psyche. In certain types of schizophrenia, there is an enormous fantasy production in the unconscious and an impoverishment of it in consciousness, of either thinking or, as Eugen Bleuler pointed out, of emotion and affect. The conscious personality is in disharmony with the wealth of vitality from the unconscious. Therefore, one of the most essential problems of the human race is to build an ego which functions in a healthy manner, that is, in accordance with the instinctive makeup of the total anthropos. The central religious god of our civilization is a helpless man hung on a cross. He is condemned to suffering and complete passivity, and that is what the very active, self-willed Western man worships and prays to, what he needs to meditate upon. In terms of our psychodynamic processes, the unconscious helps the ego to develop naturally into a healthy ego that can function adequately in its environment. It does this by being the source of the generative and creative activity within the psyche. Spontaneous new impulses and growth in our personality begin as developments from the unconscious that integrate themselves into consciousness and are adopted by our ego as they become habitual. When the ego fights against influences from the unconscious, it represses them. Repression is the psychological mechanism by which disagreeable aspects of consciousness are forced into the unconscious. As a young child, it can be positively disagreeable to adopt the responsibility of becoming adult, and so the wish to remain infantile, especially in our society, is unconscious but ever present. There is a population of men who do not wish to grow up, and, in fact, wish to remain as close to children as possible. Men who cannot take no for an answer, who wish to be coddled by their mothers until the day they die, and who refuse to do anything more than what is expected of them. This conscious repression, which often includes feminine psychological traits such as tenderness, emotional awareness, and vulnerability, inevitably manifests in psychological symptoms and social and interpersonal difficulties. It goes without saying that in healthy psychological development, psychological defense mechanisms are less prevalent, as the psyche ebbs and flows rather smoothly. But in forms of neurosis and psychosis, defense mechanisms like repression abound. It is an interesting point that Von Franz makes about the worship of the Christian God, Jesus, who hangs passively on the cross, almost as a reflection to the Western man that his mindset is opposite of what he prays to. Von Franz continues with the discussion of the concept of feminine justice. She writes, "To make laws and decide what is to happen to those who break them in our countries a man's way of dealing with the problem. Our laws are based on Roman law and patriarchal mentality, so that we always think of punishment as having to do with the masculine world, and of women as representing the principle of charity and of exceptions. However, according to the mythological standards, there is also feminine justice, and a feminine principle of revenge, or the revenge of nature, as she puts it. It is the natural consequence. Wrong behavior is followed by bad luck or illness. Punishment and revenge are not brought about only by humans, but also by a process of revenge in nature. Sometimes the same thing happens psychologically too. A wrong attitude, not necessarily immoral, but one not in accordance with nature, is also avenged, and the person will have bad luck, though no moral law has been broken. It could be called punishment by natural processes, or the revenge of the natural process of things. In most primitive mythologies, there is an aspect of the feminine goddess of nature known as Nemesis, revenge, fate, and Themis, justice. The principle of justice in the Jewish Kabbalah belongs to the left, that is, to the feminine side of the Sephiroth tree. So justice is a feminine quality according to Jewish symbolism, which seems very strange. But such Themis' revengefulness in nature brings us to a very serious situation, one of the greatest present-day problems in our world, namely, that created by the great improvement in medicine due to the rational and technical development of the white man's civilization, This is basically due to the domination of the white races. Pretty soon, there will be a world that is hopelessly overpopulated. In a couple hundred years, the situation will be absolutely hopeless. But the United Nations and other organizations continue to improve hygienic conditions in India and other Eastern countries and help to overpopulate the Earth. Possibly, nature will invent a new virus, and a virus capable of fantastic mutations, or bring about such a state of irritation that Russia or the United States or some other country will use an atom bomb, because somehow humanity has to be reduced. As on the nose as this statement may be, especially in the wake of COVID-19 and the rise of fascism in America and Europe and the lingering fear of World War III, this feminine concept of nature's justice enacts itself upon individuals every day. I have an extremely religious patient with OCD. We got to chatting about his obsessions and compulsions and how they are not a result of his moral failings, but are likely related to the stringent and rigid expectations that he has on himself to stay pure and holy. His beliefs about purity and cleanliness, remember, cleanliness is next to godliness, really force natural justice upon him through maintaining and observing these obsessive thoughts about washing his hands and compulsively doing so. He has even admitted to withholding listening to music he enjoys because it takes the Lord's name in vain. He has deprived himself of going out with his friends as punishment for not studying hard enough for tests, and he's anxious about sex and has nocturnal emissions because he believes that these biological processes and urges are, though natural, inherently wrong and sinful. This is natural justice at work for a wrong attitude, as Von Franz puts it. As I've told him on multiple occasions, my job is not to get him to rethink his religion or challenge his religious beliefs, but changing the relationship that he has to his thoughts and modifying some of his irrational schemas are going to be a necessary part of the work we do together. He's already making significant progress, his hands are looking better, and they're healing after every session. He is already beginning to think about things differently. His prognosis is good. When the man's mind is in the course of awakening, it generally goes through a phase of entanglement and needs a thorough realization that further awakening is necessary. That concludes this episode of So You Want to Learn Psychology? I hope you enjoyed. There didn't seem to be much of a discussion about femininity or fairy tales in this episode. Isn't that curious? It's because the book itself isn't generally about women or fairy tales, but more about the feminine aspect of myths, stories, and tales that provide us with deeper psychological insights that affect all people, regardless of sex or gender. If you're interested in reading more, I'd recommend purchasing the book and diving in more fully. This video should serve as a very basic introduction to the topic, and with that, I would like to thank you for your support, and I'll see you next week. Until next time.